Thank you, Peter. Once wheat is out of the ground, it's very hard to kill it with drought, which is just as well when you're farming in the WA wheat belt. You'll all remember how dry it was in June last year and how dry it was in May the year before. You'll also remember how stressed the crops became. But how many crops actually died? When I started my PhD in 1980, at the University of Adelaide, I exposed young wheat plants to water stress in pots, and I could easily kill them if I forgot to water them for 10 days. But now, more than 30 years later, I still can't kill them in the field, even after 6 weeks with next to no rain. Of course, drought doesn't have to kill wheat plants in order to affect their productivity. And different wheat varieties respond to drought in different ways. That is the focus of this presentation. I'm Bob French, Senior Research Officer in DAFWA at Merredin, and I've been doing cropping systems research for more than 30 years. It's mostly been with lupins and pulses, but more recently with canola and wheat. Response to drought, especially at the beginning of the growing season, has been something of a pet topic. I said that wheat was very hard to kill once it's out of the ground, but first you have to get it out of the ground. So I distinguish between two types. Press the wrong button. I distinguish between two types of early water deficit. The first is seedbed water deficit, which affects the processes of germination and emergence, and the second is early vegetative water deficit, which affects early growth and tillering and can also affect crop development. I'm going to say something about both types of stress today. Seedbed water deficit can arise in dry sown crops if the first rains of the growing season are light, or in crops sown into rapidly drying soil. American research has shown that wheat will germinate in very dry soil, even below the crop lower limit, but that more water is required for the young seedling to grow to reach the soil surface. I have inconclusive evidence from a trial in 2012 that wheat genotypes differ in their sensitivity to water deficit at this stage, but it is inconclusive. Well, how long can wheat survive in dry soil without emerging? I'm going to show you some data from my colleague, Mohammed Amjad. He planted a trial at Moorine Rock on the 1st of May 2013. But there was very little rain in the next 10 weeks and nothing emerged until after a rain on the 11th of July. I think in the meantime, the biggest rainfall event was about 4 millimetres. This is what the site looked like on the 25th of June. And these are some of the more advanced plants at the site that we dug up. You can see they haven't progressed very far, but they are definitely alive. After remaining dormant in the soil for that length of time, 60% of the viable seeds that were sown at that site ended up emerging and becoming established plants. And the important point that I want to draw from this graph is that there was no difference between the varieties that were sown at that site in their establishment after that long dry period in the soil. So from this point of view, all varieties are equally suitable for dry sowing. Of course, there were significant differences in yields at in that trial, but these could all be explained by matching maturity type with the very short growing season that necessarily resulted from not emerging until towards the end of July. The highest yielding varieties in the trial were Mace, Wild Catcham and Emu Rock. Now, sometimes when there's been summer rain, there will be soil moisture at depth overlain by dry soil. And early crop establishment can be achieved by sowing seed deeper than normal to place the seed on moist soil. So the next question that I want to consider is, how deep can wheat be planted? Well, in 2013, we tested the ability of wheat cultivars to emerge from depth at several different locations in wet and dry soil. And planting wheat at 70 millimetres deep in dry, loamy soils reduced establishment by up to 60% when compared to sowing at 50 millimetres. There was some variation between the sites in the variety effects, but Magenta, Estoc, Emu Rock and Cobra were less affected than Mace, Kalingari and Korak, although you will see that there's quite a big inconsistency between the results for Korak at Merredin and Mullawa, and I would hesitate to attach too much weight to the result for Kalingari that was only grown at the Mullawa site, because the seed lot that we used had quite a low germination percentage. But it's also worth noting that in these two trials, sowing at 70 millimetres had no effect on the grain yield at the end of the season when compared to the shallower sowing. I mentioned that we also had wet and dry sowings in these trials, and again, there was no difference in the grain yield of any variety between the wet and dry sowings at the same seeding depth. So again, from this point of view, there's no difference between all of these varieties are equally suitable for dry sowing, although I might qualify that a little bit later on. And in this slide here, this photograph was taken on the 5th of July at Mullawa. On the left, you see deep sown magenta. On the right is magenta sown at the shallower depth. There's not much difference in the appearance of the plots in these photographs, but you'll notice on the right of the deep one, I think that plot might have been Kalingari, and it's much thinner. But those two magenta plots yielded exactly the same at the end of the season. We did another trial near Dalwallinu where we sowed wheat at 120 millimetres on a sandy soil. We actually tried to sow it at 90 millimetres, but it ended up being a bit deeper than that. And in this case, establishment was also reduced by up to 45%, and this time Wild Catcham, Magenta and Estoc were less affected than Mace, Emu Rock, Korak and Cobra. And it's really quite startling that On the loamy soils, we got similar types of reductions with deep sowing at only 70 millimetres as we got at 120 millimetres on a sandy soil. And in fact, at the Mullewa trial that I showed you, when we did our wet sowing, the deep sowing went in at about 100 millimetres rather than 70 millimetres, and that really knocked the establishment about very badly. So sowing depth response is quite sensitive to soil type. But getting back to this site near Dalwallinu, in Mace and Corac, we also noticed that there was up to a 2-week delay in emergence from the deep sowing. So those deep sown crops were also less vigorous because of that delay in sowing when they were sown deep. And at this site, deep sowing did reduce yield, and the percentage reduction in yield was very closely related to how much establishment was reduced. And this shows the effects of the varieties. Now, what I would like to show you here is that Estoc was the least sensitive variety to deep sowing in terms of grain yield, also in terms of establishment, but it wasn't the best variety to sow at that site. It was one of the lowest yielding. So response to sowing depth in the sorts of scenarios that I'm talking about is not the only criterion to consider when you're deciding what variety to plant. And the highest yields from deep sowing, from sowing at 120 millimetres in this trial, were from Wild Catcham, Magenta and Corac. So in all of these trials, seeding depth, soil moisture was good when the crop was emerging. So I said that in the trial at Merredin and at Mullewa that we had wet and dry sowings, but when the dry sowings emerged, there was a good opening rain, and the soil was uniformly wet in the seedbed range during the establishment process. So there was no water stress actually experienced during that process. Now, I think in some situations that the seedbed moisture relations will not be so favourable. So there is the possibility, very real possibility, that those variety responses to seeding depth might change depending on the amount of water present in the seedbed, and the best I can say there is that we need some further research in order to properly answer that question. So far I've talked about what I called at the beginning of the talk seedbed water deficit. We've also studied the effects of early vegetative water deficit, and this was done in a trial at the Managed Environment Facility at Merredin in 2013. We had good early May rain at Merredin in 2013, so the stress that it was experienced in the trial that I'm going to present to you now didn't start to bite until the 3 to 4 leaf stage and was not as severe as sometimes we've observed. But it was enough to reduce biomass production at the 7 to 8 leaf stage by 40 to 45% compared to treatments that were given 50 millimetres of irrigation during May. Now, we also had a treatment where we gave 10 millimetres in May, And even that small amount of irrigation, that was enough to almost completely eliminate the reduction in biomass that was observed in the most severe treatment. So that, I think, underlines the fact that when there is even a little bit of moisture in the subsoil when a crop's planted, the wheat can go for a very long time before it begins to experience a stress that's going to limit production later on in the season. So here I have some grain yields from this trial. This trial had a very large number of genotypes in it, so I've only presented data for the most relevant ones. And I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that the yields are very, very high, probably higher than you'd expect to see in Merredin more than 1 year in 20 or something like that. The reason for this is that all of the treatments were given the same amount of irrigation over the entire growing season because we wanted to eliminate the effects of total water supply. So the ones that weren't given any irrigation in May, or the ones that were given 10 millimetres of irrigation in May, in August they were given 50 or 40 millimetres, whereas the ones that had been given 50 in May weren't given any later in the season. So there's a complicating issue of having different water supply during grain filling. So when we recognise that, the data do show that the period of early stress did reduce grain yield, and it was by different amounts in different cultivars. And the most sensitive cultivars that I've presented here are Espada, Estoc, and Tamarin Rock. Now, another thing that I would like you to notice is that the treatments that were given 10 millimetres in May, so the ones that weren't quite as severely stressed, they generally yielded better than the ones that hadn't experienced any early stress. So that's the comparison between the blue and the green bars. And I attribute that to the better water supply during grain filling. And that was particularly noticeable in the case of Kalingari and Korak. And you'll also notice that varieties like Axe, Emu Rock and Zippy, that are very early maturing varieties, seem to be relatively insensitive to the effects of early drought, and that may be a consequence of the inability of those varieties to respond to better conditions during grain filling because of the earliness of their maturity. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about the best way or the correct way to interpret these results. And one conclusion that we can draw is that variety response to early stress is highly likely to depend on the seasonal finish. So I do have some messages for you to take home. The first one is that wheat will survive in dry soil for a very long time without emerging, and that commonly grown varieties in Western Australia all seem to survive equally well. The second message is when deep sowing to chase moisture Remember that wheat varieties differ in their ability to emerge from depth, and this may not affect grain yield. And the third one is that water deficit during tillering can reduce grain yield, and this varies between varieties. The size of the reduction depends on the type of seasonal finish.
Bob, Ian Edwards, EdStar Genetics. When you referred to the deep seeding and the variable emergence that you got with that, did you look at Coleoptile length? Because those varieties carrying the RHT8 gene would have longer coleoptile and accordingly better emergence, and that's something that can be very easily selected for.
Yes, we did measure the coleoptile length of all of the varieties that we used in those trials, and tried to relate the reduction in emergence to coleoptile length, and there was a very loose relationship. So the ones that performed best were the ones that had the longest coleoptiles out of the set, and you might have noticed that at the Dalwallinu site, Wild Catcham performed well, and Wild Catcham has a reputation for being a short coleoptile variety, but in the measurements that we made, the seed lot that we used actually was longer than some of the other varieties, so I don't know what that means. But the other thing was that at some of the sites, even varieties that did have long coleoptiles didn't perform particularly well. So there are other aspects of seed quality that's also influencing the response.
Bob, on your first slide there where you had that little wheat seed germinated, and then the amount of reduction in the soil across all varieties was the same, but did the wheat seed that had the little shoot on, did that actually make it through? Or is that the ones that they are the ones that didn't? Was it just because of the late rain you got your extra 60% that came up?
Well, that particular one didn't make it through.
Yeah, obviously.
But at that stage when we dug it up, it was still alive, so it would have been capable of making it through, but that was a couple of weeks before we had the rain, so whether those ones actually survived until it rained or whether it was seed that was still in a less germinated state, I can't really say.
Oh, Bob, Greg Kirk. Bob, have you done any research on how often those conditions happen? I mean, they seem to happen every year, but do you have any numbers on those long dry spells after seeding?
One of the things that I have committed to do in my GRDC project is to model the likelihood of those sorts of conditions happening in a range of locations on a range of soil types across the cereal growing regions of Australia. So far my attempts to model that haven't been terribly enlightening, but it's something that I am certainly going to keep working on, and I hope that at Crop Updates next year I'll be able to give you a definitive answer.
Tim Sutter, Department of Agriculture. Bob, what level of confidence do you have that the results here are reproducible or are maybe affected by other regional locations, other soil types or other environmental factors like that?
If you're talking about the seeding depth results, I suspect that they are going to be quite strongly affected by environmental things like moisture level of the soil, for example. And I don't know whether the discrimination between the varieties would change enormously, although there was some indication in those results that some varieties behave quite differently at different sites. But I would hesitate to say that it's safe to go out and plant wheat at 120 millimetres on a sandy soil, because the moisture relations of that soil when it was planted were really ideal, and so those plants weren't under any stress during that process. I'm sure that if they had been under a bit of stress during that time, they would have taken longer to reach the surface and would have respired away. A lot of them would have respired away their reserves before they got there. So from that point of view, I think that environmental conditions will be very important, and the difference between the responses on the sandy soil and the loamy soil also seem to indicate that soil type's very important. I can't tell you how it would work across a big range of soil types, but you do raise a very valid point.
Last question.
Bob, Tony Sash. The take-home message then, Bob, would seem that if there is marginal moisture, you really don't let it worry you too much. Then you can keep going with your program. Is that how you're reading it then?
I think that in the past we have tended to be too conservative. I remember some old farmers at Merredin saying to me, I tried to tell my sons to stop seeding because it was getting too dry, and they just kept going, and we got fantastic crops. And so I think that wheat really is a very resilient species at that time of the season, and we can keep going for longer than perhaps we might have in the past. But there still is a danger that you can lose crops, I guess, if they start to germinate and then get too far and won't survive until the next rain. But exactly where that cut-off is, I don't know.